The sound of Sierra's slap cracked like a gunshot through the crystal ballroom of the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas. 143 guests froze in unison, their conversations cut short. The waltz from the string quartet faltered on a sour note, then died away. My prescription glasses flew from my face, skittering across the polished marble floor with a sharp clack, as if to announce to everyone, this old woman had just been put back in her place. "You brought this on yourself, Joanne!" Sierra's voice ripped through the suffocating silence. The $8,000 Vera Wang wedding gown swished with every step as she advanced on me. "What does someone your age need with so much space, anyway?" "Christopher and I need the Highland Park condo to begin our new life together." I touched my cheek, still burning from the slap, the heat pulsing all the way to my fingertips. Around me, the familiar faces of Dallas high society, oil barons, real estate magnates, and even old friends of my husband David, stared at me. Their eyes held no pity, only the morbid fascination of people watching a car crash. Not one of them stepped forward to help, as my knees buckled, joints cracking, while I struggled to pick up the shattered lenses. Sierra smoothed the shimmering fabric of her gown, lifted her chin, and spoke as though I no longer existed. "Christopher and I have tried to speak reasonably with you for months, but you became difficult, stubborn. Everyone here understands. Old people are always like that." I looked toward my son, Christopher, the boy I had once held through nightmares, the child I had once cheered for on the Little League field, now stood motionless beside his new bride. His eyes were glued to the hardwood floor, as if the intricate patterns mattered more than his mother's humiliation. "You are no longer welcome in our new home," Sierra went on, her voice syrupy sweet but dripping poison. "We've found a very charming nursing home in Plano, much more suitable for your condition." The word condition slid from her mouth like a drop of venom. Whispers immediately rippled through the room. "Poor thing, she really does look senile." "Sierra's right. Living alone at that age is dangerous. Maybe they should call the agency for elder protection." I rose to my feet, clutching the broken glasses in my hand. In that moment, something inside me shattered, and then was reborn. For 3 years, I had endured snide remarks, venomous hints about my outdated ways. For 3 years, I had watched my son turn into a stranger, seeing me only as an obstacle. For 3 years, I had chosen silence for the sake of peace. But here, in this glittering ballroom, under hundreds of pitying and judgmental stares, with my son refusing to lift his head and a woman who dared to slap me on her wedding day, I understood. Some secrets cannot be carried alone forever. I reached into my worn black handbag, my hand trembling yet decisive, and pulled out my phone. I dialed a number that anyone in this room would recognize at the mere mention. The arrival of this man was a certain sign. Someone was about to lose everything. "Carlos?" I said, my voice ringing clear in the tense silence. "It's me, Joanne." "Come to the Adolphus immediately. Bring every single file we discussed." All of them. I paused, watching Sierra's confident smile tremble for the first time that night. It's time they knew whose property they're trying to steal. Snapping the phone shut, I locked eyes with Sierra. Her face paled beneath the layers of professional makeup. 30 minutes, darling." "That's all the time you have before your little world comes crashing down." Later, it would make headlines in the Dallas Morning News, spread like wildfire across social media, and forever change how this city's elite spoke about family, money, and the dangerous mistake of underestimating the elderly. But before that moment arrived, let me tell you how. A simple widow from Highland Park managed to bring down a $50,000 wedding with a single phone call. If you too believe that truth will always prevail, hit subscribe to Revenge Tales and join me on the journey of unmasking deception. But what had Joanne hidden in that folder all these years, powerful enough to overturn the entire banquet tonight? While waiting for Carlos, I sat still in my old Honda Accord, my hands still trembling as I replayed what had just happened in the ballroom minutes earlier. My cheeks still burned from Sierra's slap, but the greater pain was Christopher's eyes, my son, the boy I had cherished all my life, standing there like a statue, letting his wife humiliate his own mother in front of hundreds. How had things slipped so far? I closed my eyes, letting memory pull me back 2 years. Mom, I want you to meet my girlfriend. Christopher's smile was radiant as he led Sierra into my Highland Park apartment for the first time. I remember clearly how Sierra's eyes swept across the home. The 15-year-old leather sofa David and I had chosen, the faded curtains, the small kitchen with its old refrigerator. "Oh, how cozy," she said, but her tone was laced with disappointment. I saw her glance at David's worn Rolex on my wrist, then at the handbag I had carried for 5 years. Back then, I thought perhaps this young woman was simply used to luxury and not accustomed to my modest surroundings. I even felt insecure, afraid I wasn't modern enough to be the mother-in-law of such a beautiful, glamorous girl. That evening, I spent the entire afternoon preparing Christopher's childhood favorites: Texas barbecue, cornbread, apple pie from his grandmother's recipe. But Sierra hardly touched any of it, merely cutting the food into small pieces and pushing it around her plate. "I'm avoiding carbs," she said with a strained smile. "I have to keep my figure for work." Then came the questions that sounded caring, but carried a probing edge. "Do you live here all by yourself? Isn't it hard managing on just your pension? This apartment is really big. Don't you think about moving somewhere smaller? Do you have any plans for the future? I mean, financially?" Christopher just laughed and kept eating, never realizing that his future wife was assessing his own mother like an asset. From that day on, Sierra started visiting regularly. She always brought real estate magazines, flyers for retirement communities. "Mrs. Joanne, look at this place. It's amazing," she would say eagerly, spreading brochures across the table. "There are nurses on duty 24/7, lots of social activities, meals prepared for you. You'd have friends your own age to talk to." Outwardly, I smiled politely, but inside I felt deeply uneasy. Why would a 28-year-old be so fixated on where a 68-year-old woman would live? Then one day, while Christopher was out, I overheard Sierra on the phone in the kitchen. "Yes, Mom, the Highland Park condo. The property values here are sky high. If we can convince her to move, we'll live comfortably here until we buy our own place. She's so naive, she'll probably thank us for it." Those words cut into me like a knife. I almost walked in to confront her, but when Christopher returned, I stayed silent. I told myself, maybe I misheard. Maybe I was being paranoid. If I had trusted my ears then, perhaps things would have turned out differently. But I chose silence, and that silence became the trap that pushed me, step by step, closer to the edge. Sierra's advice grew more blunt with time. "Mrs. Joanne, last time I saw you, forgot to turn off your blinker. At your age, reflexes slow down, and you don't even realize it. Your fridge has so many expired items. It would be better if Christopher and I handled the shopping. I don't understand why you're still working. At your age, you should be resting, enjoying life. Is working at the flower shop really necessary?" Each remark was like a tiny needle, draining away my confidence, and Christopher only nodded, parroting her words like a puppet. "Mom, Sierra's right. You should enjoy your retirement." I began to suffer endless sleepless nights. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself, had I truly become a burden? Was Sierra right? Was I selfish for keeping such a large apartment while the young couple needed space? I remember clearly the night before their engagement. I called Natalie, my only niece who still checked in on me regularly. "Aunt Joanne, what's wrong? You sound so sad." "Natalie, I feel like I'm a burden to Christopher. Sierra says I should move to someplace more suitable for my age." "Auntie," Natalie cut me off, firm. "You're only 68. You're healthy. You're still working. Why should you move?" Her words gave me a moment of clarity. But later, when Christopher and Sierra brought friends over, I was thrown back into doubt. Sierra smiled sweetly as she introduced me. "This is Christopher's mother. She still lives alone in that big apartment. We worry so much about her." The pitying glances swung toward me. "He's such a devoted son." With Sierra looking after her, that's such a relief. At her age, living alone is really dangerous. That night, I cried for the first time in years. Not out of weakness, but out of rage. Rage at myself for letting others define who I was, what I needed. But I still couldn't break free. Not yet. Not until tonight. Sierra's slap had jolted me awake from a nightmare that had lasted 2 years. Headlights flared at the far end of the parking lot. Carlos had arrived. Carlos Rodriguez stepped out of the glossy black Mercedes, his arms cradling the familiar brown leather briefcase. Even in the dim light of the parking lot, I could see the stern set of the man who had stood by my family for 20 years. "Mrs. Joanne?" Carlos said as he came closer, his voice low and steady. "Are you certain about this? Once we go in, there's no turning back." I looked toward the ballroom, where the warm lights still glittered and the music and laughter still echoed. Christopher and Sierra were surely whispering to guests right now that his elderly mother had suffered an episode. Maybe they even pitied me, murmuring that age had made me stubborn and unpleasant. "Completely certain," I replied. 20 years protecting a secret, 20 years living like a poor woman to protect the family. And this is how they repay me. Carlos opened his briefcase beneath the parking lot light and began pulling out stacks of documents Christopher had never seen. "This is the statement for your primary investment account. Current balance, $8,200,000. He handed me the first sheet. "This is the title deed for the office building downtown in Dallas. Rental income, $85,000 per month." Each paper was a cross-section of my real life, the life I had hidden so carefully. I was not just an ordinary widow. I had been David's business partner, not merely the shadow behind my husband. Carlos lowered his voice as he handed over another file. "And this is proof of the transfers you've been making to Christopher over the past 3 years." I took the bank statement and felt my throat tighten. The numbers told a story I had never allowed myself to see whole. $247,000. Rent, credit card bills, car insurance, even the deposit for tonight's wedding. "I thought I was helping my son through a hard time," I whispered. "I never expected I was bankrolling the plan to ruin my life." Carlos nodded, his gaze heavy. "And there's more. We have investigated Sierra and her family." He placed a thick dossier before me. "Sierra has done the same to 2 other men before Christopher. Both had widowed mothers who owned valuable properties. Blood felt like it froze in my veins." "You mean—" "Sierra follows a very clear pattern. She infiltrates a family, mines financial information, and calculates every move. With Christopher, she even hired a private detective to dig into you before they were engaged." In that moment, I realized it was worse than I had imagined. This was not only a daughter-in-law's betrayal. It was a carefully orchestrated scheme, and bitterest of all, Christopher had been complicit. He knew money from somewhere was coming in, yet he never asked. He accepted the luxury his salary could never cover. If I stayed silent one more time, this time I would lose everything. I sat motionless in the car, letting that truth seep into my bones. Images of small Christopher returned, the child who used to clutch me through thunder, who made clumsy Mother's Day cards from colored paper. Now he had chosen to stand with that woman rather than with me. "Carlos," I said, my voice shaking with anger, "I want you to stop all transfers immediately, cancel the lease guarantees, and—" I hesitated, swallowing hard. Part of my heart still clung to the memory of that little boy. "Mrs. Joanne?" Carlos asked softly. "Cancel everything," I said decisively. including the payment for tonight's wedding. I want them to face the consequences. We walked into the ballroom like two actors taking the stage. The music cut off abruptly. 143 eyes turned toward us. A few guests recognized Carlos immediately. Among Dallas's elite, he was known as the man with the briefcase. His arrival signaled a storm was coming. Sierra stood in the middle of the dance floor in her pristine white gown. When she saw us, the confident smile on her face vanished. "Joanne, what are you playing at now?" Sierra shouted, her voice quavering. "You've caused enough trouble. Today is our wedding." "Ladies and gentlemen," Carlos announced clearly, "I apologize for the interruption, but I have urgent legal matters to discuss with Mr. Christopher Hughes and Mrs. Sierra Hughes." The room fell silent. Some guests raised their phones, ready to capture the rare moment. Christopher stepped toward us, his face pale. "Mom, what is going on? Who is this man?" Strangely, I felt an odd calm. After years of pretending to be the frail mother, I could finally stand in my own strength. "Christopher," I said, my voice even and firm. "This is Carlos Rodriguez, my financial advisor for 20 years. He's here to tell you things you never understood about your mother." Sierra approached, her expression haughty with a flicker of worry. "Financial advisor? Ridiculous! She works at a flower shop and lives on a pension. What does she need a financial advisor for?" Carlos opened his briefcase with unshaken composure and pulled out the first document. "Mrs. Sierra, I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding, and I think everyone here will want to listen." He looked around the room and his voice rang like a bell. "Please, everyone, have a seat. What I'm about to disclose will surprise you all." In that moment, seeing Christopher's ashen face and Sierra's stunned look, I knew, from here on, there was no turning back. Carlos set the briefcase on the nearest console table, unlocked it, and arranged the papers slowly, methodically. The entire ballroom seemed frozen. Guests gradually gathered closer, equal parts curious and uneasy. The scent of orchids and perfumed candles still hung in the air, strangely at odds with the tension strung tight as wire. "Mr. Christopher Hughes," Carlos began, his voice calm and seasoned like a lawyer in court, "please be advised, the financial guarantee your mother provided for your lease has been revoked effective immediately." Christopher stood rooted to the spot. "Financial guarantee? Mom, what is he talking about?" But in my son's eyes, I caught a flicker I knew well. He knew. For 3 years, he had wondered about the unexpected bonuses flowing into his account. He had suspected, but chosen not to ask, because the answer might have made him uncomfortable. In addition, Carlos continued without pause, the monthly transfers of $6,850 Mrs. Joanne has been making into your personal account have been permanently stopped. This includes payments for your credit cards, car insurance, and other expenses you believed were covered from other sources. Sierra's gasp echoed sharply in the silence. She lunged forward, her wedding gown sweeping across the marble floor. "That's impossible! Joanne is a poor old woman. She works at a flower shop, drives an old car, wears second-hand clothes." Sierra nearly shouted, her face red with anger and confusion. Carlos regarded her with the patience of a teacher repeating a lesson for the 3rd time. "Mrs. Sierra, what you describe is exactly what Mrs. Joanne wanted everyone to believe. For 20 years, she and her late husband have lived modestly by design to protect their family's privacy and safety." He drew out the first statement. "Mrs. Joanne's primary investment account currently has a balance of $8.2 million. Gasps rippled through the room. I saw Mrs. Patterson, the wife of the First National Bank's chairman, grip a chair to keep from sinking down. "Secondly," Carlos went on, "Mrs. Joanne owns the Patterson Plaza office building in downtown Dallas, producing $85,000 in monthly rental income." At that, Mr. Patterson himself had to sit down. The building he used for his own office every day, it turned out, belonged to the woman he had pitied only minutes before. Sierra's face drained of color. No, it can't. But she lived like someone who thinks ahead. I spoke for the first time since entering the room. Sierra, you've just learned your first lesson about not judging people by appearances. Carlos flipped to another file. And this may be the most painful information for you, Mr. Christopher. Over the past 3 years, your mother has transferred a total of $247,000 to cover your living expenses without your knowledge. For the first time that night, Christopher spoke. Mom, I paid your rent, your credit cards, your car insurance, even part of the costs of this wedding, I said, feeling tears spring to my eyes for the first time that evening. I thought I was helping you through a hard time, not bankrolling the plan to destroy my own life. A sob broke from the corner of the room. Natalie, my niece, had been there watching from the start. She stepped forward, tears streaming. Christopher, Aunt Joanne called me last week. She was crying, thinking she'd become a burden. She even asked if she should move into a nursing home because Sierra told her she couldn't take care of herself. Natalie's words cut into Christopher like knives. He looked at Sierra, his face stunned, as the full scope of the scheme came into view. Finally, Carlos said, his voice tightening. The $73,000 payment for this event, including the ballroom, catering, music, flowers, and photography, has been canceled. The hotel management will now require immediate replacement payment. The whole room held its breath. I could hear the wall clock ticking as if counting down. Just one word, who would pay, was about to decide the fate of the two who had struck at my dignity. And in that pin-drop silence, I knew the expensive lesson was about to begin. Sierra stood frozen for a moment, then collapsed to the floor, her gown spreading like a wilted flower. She burst into sobs. Everything's ruined, everything we planned, everything we worked for. Worked for? I cut in. You call deceiving and manipulating an elderly woman work? Christopher stammered. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't think. You didn't think what, Christopher? My voice was ice. You didn't think when you let your wife tell friends your mother was old and needed to be put away? You didn't think when Sierra brought appraisers into my home without my knowledge? You didn't think when you let your wife slap me in front of 143 people? Each question landed like a punch to the gut. Christopher bowed his head, unable to meet my eyes. From the crowd, Harvey, my 70-year-old neighbor, suddenly spoke up. He had driven over at my request to bring a few documents. Joanne, Harvey said loudly enough for all to hear, I personally saw Sierra bringing strangers to measure your apartment from outside last week. When they saw me, they hurried off, like the final nail sealing a coffin. The entire scheme lay exposed before Dallas's high society. The Adolphus hotel manager, Mr. Martinez, stepped forward, his face stern. I've just received notice of payment cancellation. The outstanding balance is $73,000. Who will be responsible? Sierra looked to Christopher for help. Christopher looked at me, pleading, but I had made my decision. You'll handle it yourselves, I said, like the adults you claim to be. Like the people who felt entitled to make decisions about their mother's life, guests began drifting off into small clusters. Some whispered, some shook their heads. They had come to a wedding and were leaving having witnessed the total collapse of a family. As Carlos and I prepared to leave, Christopher ran after us. Mom, please don't go. We can talk. We can fix this. I turned back, looking at my son one last time. Christopher, I love you. I will always love you, because you are my son. But loving doesn't mean allowing yourself to be abused. When you're ready to look me in the eye and take responsibility for what you've done, when you can prove you understand that family is built on love and respect, not on opportunism and manipulation, then we'll talk. I paused, meeting his eyes deeply. And that will happen without my money. You will have to learn to become the man I once believed you were. With that, I walked out of the Adolphus Hotel, leaving behind a son crumpled, a bride sobbing, and 143 guests who would never forget this night. For the first time in 3 years, I felt I could breathe. The next morning, I woke up in my Highland Park apartment with a strange sensation. For the first time in 3 years, I had truly slept well. No more nightmares about being forced out of my home. No more fear that every phone ring meant Sierra. No more pressure to prove I could still take care of myself. The phone started ringing at 7 a.m. News of the Adolphus showdown had spread across Dallas like wildfire. The first call came from the Dallas Morning News. "Mrs. Hughes, this is Jessica Martinez from the Dallas Morning News. We'd like to do a feature on your story. This is an important issue concerning elder abuse." I declined the interview, but I could feel a seed of an idea beginning to sprout. Perhaps my story could be useful to others. Christopher called at 10 a.m. His voice was hoarse, as if he had been crying all night. "Mom, can you talk to me? I'm listening, Christopher." "Mom, Sierra and we got thrown out of the hotel last night. We couldn't pay the bill. Now we're at Sierra's parents' house, but they're furious. They said they had no idea Sierra had done those things." I stayed silent. Part of me wanted to rush in and save my son, as I had done for the past 3 years. But another part, the stronger part, knew this was the lesson Christopher needed to learn. "Christopher, is there something you'd like to say to me?" I'm sorry, Mom." "I truly am. I didn't know Sierra had done those things. I didn't know about the money, about how you'd been helping me financially." "Didn't know or didn't want to know?" I asked gently but firmly. That question silenced him for a long while. I think I didn't want to know. I thought if I didn't ask, I wouldn't have to feel guilty about accepting help. For the first time since last night, I saw a glimmer of hope. Christopher was beginning to take responsibility for his actions. "Christopher, I need you to understand something. My ending financial support isn't punishment. It's an opportunity for you to learn how to become the man I know you can be." Natalie stopped by in the afternoon with news. "Aunt Joanne, I just spoke to a friend who works at a law office. Sierra went there this morning, trying to sue you for emotional distress and marital sabotage." I set my teacup down, weary. "And what did they say?" "They refused the case. In fact, they said if anyone's getting sued, it might be Sierra, for elder abuse and intentional infliction of emotional harm." Natalie sat beside me. "Can I ask you something? Why didn't you ever tell anyone about your money? Not even me?" I looked out the window toward the peaceful streets of Highland Park. "Natalie, your Uncle David and I saw too many families torn apart by money. Children who stopped visiting their parents once they realized there was no inheritance. Vicious fights over wills. I turned back to her. I wanted to be loved for who I am, not for what I have. I wanted to know who truly cared, and now you know," Natalie said softly. The first week after the wedding passed with small but precious discoveries. I realized I had stopped taking sleeping pills, the ones I had depended on for 2 years because of anxiety and stress. My appetite returned. I no longer checked my phone constantly for Sierra's advice. Harvey, my 70-year-old neighbor, stopped by every morning with coffee and pastries from our usual shop. "Joanne," he said one morning, "I haven't seen you this well in years. These past few years, it was like you carried an invisible weight." "That weight is gone now, Harvey," I replied. "I spent too many years shielding Christopher from the consequences of his bad decisions. I didn't realize I was turning him into someone I no longer recognized." By the weekend, Carlos arrived with more information. "Mrs. Joanne, I've dug deeper into Sierra's past. What I found is worse than we thought." He opened a thick file. Sierra was married before. In 2019, she wed a 65-year-old man in Houston. He died of a heart attack just 8 months later, and Sierra inherited his entire estate worth $1.2 million. A chill ran down my spine. He died of a heart attack? That's what the medical record says. But there are suspicious signs. He changed his will 3 times in his last 6 months, each revision more favorable to Sierra. His family tried to contest it but failed. Carlos continued, Sierra burned through that money in 2 years, lavish living and bad investments. Then she began looking for her next target. And she found Christopher, I whispered. Not only Christopher. Before him, she dated 2 other men, both with widowed mothers who owned valuable properties. Both relationships ended when those mothers refused to cooperate with Sierra's plans. I closed the file, my heart beat heavy. I had thought the night at the Adolphus was the climax, yet it was only the beginning. A question struck like lightning. If I hadn't spoken up, how many other mothers would have become the next target? In that moment, I knew my story no longer belonged to me alone. By the second week, I discovered someone had recorded video at the Adolphus and posted it online. The clip, Wedding Ruined by Mysterious Mother-in-Law, had surpassed 2 million views. Most comments were supportive. This woman's a hero. Finally, someone stood up to ungrateful kids. Sierra's clearly a gold digger. Exposing her was the right thing. Hopefully the son learns his lesson. But there were dissenting voices too. Evil old hag ruins her son's wedding. No matter how rich you are, you don't get to humiliate your kids in public. That Tuesday, I received a call from WFAA-TV. Mrs. Hughes, this is Michelle Roberts from Dallas today. We'd love to invite you for an interview. This isn't just family drama. It's a social issue. Elder abuse. For the first time, I agreed. Not for fame, but because I realized my story could help others recognize the warning signs. 3 weeks after the wedding, Christopher called again. His voice was different. Mom, I found a job. Actually 2 jobs, part-time at a restaurant and night shifts at a warehouse. Sierra left me. Are you sad? I asked. He was silent for a moment. I suppose I should be. But honestly, I feel relieved. For the first time in years, I'm not trying to please someone by living beyond my means. Christopher, I said, would you like to come to dinner with me? I could make your childhood favorites. Mom, I can really come? My door is always open to you, Christopher. But you must understand our relationship will be different. I will never again be your ATM, and I will never let anyone, not even you, treat me like an obstacle to their success. I understand, Mom, and I want to earn that respect back. I put down the phone and felt something I hadn't in a very long time. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't lost my son entirely. But first, I had a television interview to attend, and a story to tell, not only about betrayal, but about the journey of finding myself again after nearly losing it. I sat in the makeup room at the WFAA-TV studios, looking at myself in the mirror, still surprised. The young makeup artist had worked a miracle. Not to conceal age, but to highlight the new confidence in my eyes. You look radiant, she smiled. I watched the viral video. You're truly an inspiration to so many people. Michelle Roberts, the host of Dallas Today, stopped by to greet me before the taping. Mrs. Hughes, we received hundreds of emails from viewers after announcing you'd be on. Many shared stories just like yours, being financially abused by family. She paused, looking at me seriously. Are you sure? Sharing financial details is very private. Michelle, I replied, I kept that secret for 20 years to protect my family. Now I'm sharing it to protect other families. The studio lights came up and the cameras began to roll. Michelle introduced the story with a professional voice edged with emotion. Today, we meet Mrs. Joanne Hughes, 68, the focus of attention after a video of a confrontation at her son's wedding spread online. But this is not just family drama. It is a story about elder abuse and one woman's journey to reclaim her strength. Michelle turned to me. Can you tell us what happened over the last 3 years? I drew a deep breath, then began. I spoke of Sierra's toxic remarks, of how Christopher slowly became a stranger, of sleepless nights spent doubting myself. The worst part, I said, was not that they wanted my money, but that they wanted me to believe I couldn't take care of myself. They wanted me to believe I had become a burden. What made you decide to reveal the truth? Michelle asked. The slap, I answered simply. When Sierra slapped me in front of 143 people, and no one, my own son included, spoke up, I realized I had lost myself in the effort to protect them. Mrs. Hughes, Michelle leaned in, a lot of viewers are curious about the scale of the assets you kept hidden. Can you share? I looked straight into the lens, knowing Christopher might be watching. My late husband and I own about $12 million in assets, real estate, investments, and a trust fund. Over the past 3 years, I transferred nearly $250,000 to support Christopher without his knowledge. A flicker of surprise crossed Michelle's face, even though she'd been briefed. Why did you live so modestly? David, my husband, used to say that money changes people. We saw too many families fall apart over inheritance, children treating parents like ATMs. We wanted Christopher to love us for who we were, not for what we had. I choked up. As it turns out, that decision saved me. If Christopher had known about the money from the beginning, I might never have seen who he truly was. Michelle steered the conversation to what mattered most to me. What advice would you give older adults in similar situations? I looked into the lens, knowing thousands needed to hear this. First, trust your instincts. If something feels off, put-downs about your abilities, pressure to make major financial decisions, or a sense you're being isolated from friends, those may be signs. Second, don't make significant financial decisions under pressure. People who truly love you will respect the time you need to think. And finally, my voice steadied, remember, you deserve respect, no matter your age. Getting older does not mean becoming a burden or losing your agency. In that moment, I saw not just studio lights. I saw invisible faces, mothers, fathers, people suffering in silence. I understood that if I didn't speak fully today, they might never speak. And I decided this story would not end here. The taping had barely finished when my phone began ringing non-stop. Not only reporters, but complete strangers. The first call brought me to tears. Mrs. Hughes, I'm Margaret Chen in San Antonio 74. I'm going through the same thing with my daughter. After watching your interview for the first time in 2 years, I dared to say no. Thank you. Because of you, I know I am not alone. The second call was from a Houston attorney. I'm David Park, specializing in elder law. We've just received 15 calls in 2 hours from people seeking advice. Would you like to partner to help more of them? 3 days after the interview, Christopher came for dinner. For the first time in years, he came alone. No Sierra, no agenda. He was thinner, tired, but his eyes were brighter. There was something, perhaps integrity, I hadn't seen in a long time. Mom, he said as we ate barbecue and cornbread, his childhood favorites. I watched the interview. How did you feel? Ashamed. And proud at the same time, he set down his fork. Ashamed of what I did to you, but proud that you stood up for yourself. He looked up. Mom, I want you to know I've started therapy. I need to understand why I became like that. Christopher, I softened. I'm proud of that decision. Mom, are you still proud of me? He asked, in the voice of a child. I thought for a moment. I'm not proud of what you did. But I am proud that you're repairing it. I'm proud that you're working hard to be independent. And I'm proud that you're brave enough to look in the mirror and dislike what you see. Tears fell. Mom, why did you never tell me about the money, even when I was struggling? Because I wanted you to solve your own problems. I wanted you to become a strong man, not dependent. But when I saw you flounder, motherly love overruled reason. I laid my hand over his. I thought helping in the shadows would shield you from stress while still letting you learn. But it turned out I robbed you of the chance to truly grow up. After we cleared the table, Christopher said, "Mom, I want to propose something. I know you care about helping others. Can I help you?" "Help me with what?" "I heard you're getting lots of calls for assistance. I want to work for the foundation you're planning to start. Not for money. I'll keep other jobs to support myself. I want to learn how to help other families avoid what happened to us." I looked at my son, a man finding his way back, and for the first time in months, I felt real hope. "Christopher, if you mean it, not to make amends, but because you want to make a difference, we'll discuss the details." When he left, he hugged me, the first real hug in years. Not rushed, not forced, a son's embrace of his mother. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself." That night, sitting on the balcony overlooking Highland Park, I knew my life was opening to a new chapter. One I would write my way, with clear boundaries, relationships built on mutual respect, and a purpose larger than myself. Sierra had tried to steal my home. In the end, she helped me find myself again. Thank you for staying to the end. If you're going through what Joanne went through, remember, you deserve respect, and you have the right to say no. If this video helped, please subscribe to Revenge Tales, and turn on the bell. Your support helps me keep making stories that matter. Let's talk in the comments. What boundary will you set for yourself starting today? Which journey do you want me to tell next? Healing or legal? I've also set the end screen, the next video for seamless viewing, and the Revenge Stories playlist for anyone who needs more strength. If you'd like to support, you can use Super Thanks. Every contribution will be allocated in part to support elder protection initiatives. See you in the next video.